On Point is brought to you by National Baking Company.
Good evening, welcome to On Point. I'm your host Dennis Chung. Kalila unfortunately is not with us today. She'll be back with us next week. Today we'll be discussing two very interesting topics. First, we'll be discussing the Business and Consumer Indices Survey with the man who has led the research and also has done the presentation for the past few years, Mr. Don Anderson. And then in the following segment, we'll be discussing the matter of intellectual property with the Jamaica Intellectual Property Office, and we'll be educating you on everything that you need to know about intellectual property. But first, let's take a look back at the top business stories of the week.
In at number 4, the anti-government protests in Venezuela continued this week with more clashes in the streets of Caracas. There were also reports of the opposition leader being tear-gassed, along with other reports of more Venezuelans fleeing to neighboring Colombia. In the number 3 spot, Devon House is the official gastronomy center. At the launch a few days ago, Tourism Minister Ed Bartlett said Devon House will serve as the hub for gastronomy tourism in Jamaica and hopefully the region. At number 2, a KPMG study has revealed that only 26% of companies surveyed in 28 countries including Jamaica pay sufficient attention to cybersecurity. But following the recent ransomware attack which disrupted devices and systems across the globe, the auditing firm is urging companies to take the matter more seriously. And your top business story is the first quarter results of the 2017 Business and Consumer Confidence Indices, which showed that economic confidence among Jamaican firms has remained largely unchanged during the past 5 quarters. However, consumer confidence fell to its lowest level in the past year.
When we come back, we'll be discussing the latest Business and Consumer Indices survey findings right here on Point. Welcome back. Most analysts would agree that the economy is at a stable place. But how do businesses and the everyday consumer feel about it? The latest Business and Consumer Indices were released this week. Here's a quick look at some of the findings.
The first quarter results of the 2017 Business and Consumer Confidence Indices showed that economic confidence among Jamaican firms has remained largely unchanged during the past 5 quarters. The figure remained at the most favorable levels recorded during the previous 15 years. However, consumer confidence fell to its lowest level in the past year, although it has remained more favorable than in the previous decade, with the exception of a single survey. The report also examined robust investment plans, which showed that during the past year, the willingness of firms to invest in new plant and equipment has remained near its all-time high.
We're now joined by Mr. Don Anderson, pollster extraordinaire and managing director of Market Research Services Limited. Welcome On Point, Don.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you very much.
You are the confidence man, right? You have been presenting this thing for a while, eh? You've been doing this thing for a while.
I need to give you a little background to that very quickly. The survey started in 2001. This was the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce's brainchild. So they set up the Jamaica Conference Board in 2001. We have done all the fieldwork from 2001 to present. But I was not always the presenter. The data used to go and still goes to Professor Richard Curtin at the University of Michigan, the Survey Research Center. He's one of the world's experts in business confidence and consumer confidence surveys. I believe last time I counted, he had probably set up business and consumer confidence surveys in about 50 odd countries across the world. So he's the guy, all right? In the last 4 years, I have actually been doing the presentation. So the data
seems like a lot longer though.
I know. I've just been in the public space, right? But the data goes to Professor Richard Curtin. He manipulates it, develops the indices, and he sends the data back to us. And I've been handling the presentations for a good long while now.
Okay. The recent data you presented when? Yesterday?
No, presented this morning.
This morning. It actually shows a dip in both business and consumer confidence. And interestingly, I was doing some graphs on it, and what it showed is that for the first time since 2014, when it's being tracked,
Right.
the index of consumer expectations actually dipped below the current economic conditions. You know, the expectations of businesses has always been below current business conditions. So there's a shift on the consumer side.
Yeah.
And interestingly also, today the PIOJ announced that in the first quarter that you were reporting on, there was no growth.
I must have
So
seen
there,
data.
either that or you saw theirs.
I
But-
didn't know that theirs were coming out today.
Yeah, but what is your assessment of the current information? I mean, can we see a trend developing? Does it speak to anything?
It's a little too early to say if a trend is developing. What we can say is that the data for the first quarter 2017 shows that there has been a fall off in business and consumer confidence. Again, you know, we look at the trend as a predictive tool. So whilst we only have this one quarter of fall off, I think if next quarter when we report in July, we see a continuation of this, we can say, there's a worrying trend developing, you know, which obviously needs some remedial action. I think at the moment, what we want to do is to watch to see what happens, but this is certainly not comfort. That both businesses and consumers,
Right.
both of them, I mean, not just one or the other, but both of them at almost to the same extent.
And align that with the first quarter growth information.
Exactly. You see,
Yeah.
so that's something that you need to you know, sit up and think about for sure. The comforting thing coming out of all of this is that it still is a part of almost an all-time high in terms of the indices of both businesses and consumers, right? Because the 2016 period was particularly comforting in terms of where businesses were and where consumers were. This is a fallback, you know, to a certain extent, but not to the same levels that
So it's a fall from the high.
Yes, a fall from the high.
But one would say, Don, I mean, and maybe you can interpret this for us, but it's either that the high was achieved because of the euphoria around the 1.5, or some critics might say the 1.5 is not working.
Well,
You know?
a bit of both actually, you know, because let's look back at from 2015, 2014 even, say middle of 2014, we began to see a certain amount of confidence creeping into both business and consumers that we didn't have before. Before then, we saw this spasmodic kind of significant rises and falls consequent on election promises and the failure to deliver. We saw from 2014 with the Peter Phillips administration when, you know, we were passing IMF test after IMF test. We saw that develop. The election euphoria was there, of course, but what was noticeable, and the difference was that for the 2001, 2002 election, 2007 election, 2011 election, we saw those significant peaks developing. Expectation, dissipation of expectation. In 2015, we saw a flattening at a pretty decent level because people were convinced that the economy was likely to grow based on the success with the IMF passing the IMF test.
Yeah.
So
And
it's different.
Interestingly, one of the things that dipped the most for consumers and is really worrying is expected job prospects.
Right,
And that is really telling you what's going to happen tomorrow.
right. Mark you, those expectations were never ever very high. All right. from
No,
the starters.
but it dipped significantly.
Yes, right,
You know?
right. And I tell you what, I think from middle of last year, I was certainly in the presentations talking about growing impatience on the part of the consumers because they were fed the notion that jobs will become available in the tourism sector, in the construction sector, and in addition to the 1.5 rollout, they were saying, based on all these factors, I think my standard of living is going to improve. I will be able to buy more. I'll have more disposable income. Don't think jobs are going to be plentiful, but I expect jobs to come on stream that will help me to get through my life.
So it might be a reality check that's
Reality
happening now. But that doesn't bode well, though, because if you look at the first quarter growth numbers being flat, and basically with the floods that just happened,
Yes.
you're having a worse second quarter.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
so I mean, one looking at these numbers, corroborating it with the data on the economy and what happened in the second quarter.
Right.
Things are looking so good, eh?
Probably,
looking at it dicey.
worrying indicators for sure, you know. But the key thing to note, you know, is that one of the key things to note is that it's the consumers looking down the road. And we don't give our consumers enough credit, but they look at the situation and they say, well, you know, hotel takes X number of months or years to put together. It's going to happen. The construction of roads and that type and houses. So are going to get a job down the road. But when this is taking longer to materialize than they expect, you can see them beginning to grow impatient. And there's not enough to cushion against that. The 1.5 is certainly not going to be that kind of you know, salve for their worries.
And in addition to that, I mean, you talk about the 1.5 and the euphoria around it. People are also saying, which is in contradiction to that, that they expect income to be worse.
Yep.
That they expect a change in income.
The expected change in income. This is, as you mentioned, the most significant fall off from the consumer's perspective. They're becoming quite worried. They're not seeing the thing materializing with the pace at which they want it to. And of course, unlike the businesses, you know, the consumers are knee-jerk. They think in front of their faces. A price increase comes and they have a reaction. They have to have a reaction. They have to cushion for that and find a way to deal with that. So the consumer reacts rather quickly.
Before the business.
Absolutely. Businesses, of course, are
so therefore, you're saying that it's quite possible we could see a further reduction in business confidence numbers based on consumer spending.
Absolutely. The two are related to each other.
Yeah.
For sure.
And businesses, they're not so bad now, but the worrying trend for me in terms of business is that the business expectations is always worse than the current business conditions. How do you explain that?
Well, you know, they look forward, right? And based on what they see as happening to them and their own businesses, they judge the expected on the basis of what is happening to them and what they also see around them in terms of the environment. Now, one of the things we looked at for the first time was the whole question of taxation. Remember the field work was January to March, right? So we're saying, what about taxation? They expect taxation to come and so on. And what's very interesting, and I'm deviating a little bit, what's very interesting is that businesses expected taxation. They probably don't expect the extent to it, but they understand that in the normal course of trying to run the country, you need to raise taxes or find some way of getting taxes in and getting money. They didn't think that the taxes were going to be so onerous as to impact them. In fact, businesses say, well, I expect it, but guess what? I can deal with it if you cushion it by making business easier, removing the roadblocks and the bureaucracy and so on.
So that's a significant part of the problem.
Absolutely.
Because you see...
to make the point then, Dennis, if they don't see the concomitant relaxation of those, what they consider to be roadblocks, then the whole issue of the taxation which was imposed is going to, as far as I'm concerned, assume greater proportions.
But the reason why I'm so caught up with this is because we can't turn around the economy unless the expectations of business is greater than what the current situation is.
Right.
And therefore, for me, it's a worrying trend that the expectation has never been above the current conditions. In fact, when the closest the two has been, it's not the business expectations going up to meet the conditions current. It's the current conditions coming down.
Going down. Yeah, worrying.
To meet.
Worrying, you know. But I guess against that, what you cushion or use to cushion that is the fact that businesses over the last, say, 6 quarters have been pretty confident about their intention to invest. Now, again, that's because they're in there for the long haul. You spend a bag of money to bring in new plant, you know, new equipment, hire new staff, human resources, etc. You are hoping that that will pay off. Now, here's where we probably have to segue and differentiate between hope and expectation. You know, I mean, one is we're seeing a lot more concrete hope than expectation to a large extent. And that is probably what is happening right now, which explains the difference and the dissonance between the current and the expected conditions. Businesses are confident, but as we saw in this first quarter, business confidence fell. And that to me is an overall area that we need to look at as an area of concern going forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, coupled with that though, they're also saying in one of the components that the investment/expansion climate is actually going to get worse. So the fact that you have this trending below, but this is saying that they're not so certain about the return on investment.
Right. Well, certainly the number of firms who say they intend to invest in plant and equipment and human is gone down. It's gone down. Now, I wouldn't want to go further and say it is going down, because until we look at the second quarter, that would be a little bit of a stretch to do. But it is noticeable and really of concern that something like 5% less firms this time are convinced that this is a good time to invest. So there you could see the kind of concern growing amongst the business sector, even in terms of the confidence.
Is there any categorization in terms of the firms who are willing to invest as opposed to the firms who are saying we're reducing our investments?
There is, but I don't think I can give you that data tonight. But again, we did 110 firms thereabout, and they're broken down by industry type. So that's data that can be extrapolated quite easily.
Because it would be interesting to see that.
It would be.
Because I mean, I know there are always a lot of prospects of tourism, for example. Or is it that it's going to be affected in the areas where we need to grow or comparative advantage?
It's something that I have made a note of. I would certainly do that tomorrow as we go in, because the data is there. In the same way that amongst the consumer segment, where we interviewed 600 people, the data is broken down in terms of areas, obviously in terms of demographics too. But for the purpose of the presentation, tourist areas versus Kingston areas versus other areas. And we can tell you right up front that the only area that suggests there is some degree of optimism in terms of where we are first quarter is in the tourism sector.
Which is where we're seeing the growth happening in Montego Bay, because I was down there last week, and you see a lot of activity happening there. So you're saying then that a big part of the problem may be in Kingston, for example. Kingston and St. Andrews is showing an issue.
Yeah, right.
But how do we change the situation then? Is it that there's a policy problem from government? Businesses are saying what the government is standing in their way, or is it just global issues, or what?
No, you know what businesses are saying when you ask them what is the one major problem as far as you're concerned that will hinder your growth and retard all your plans. Crime and violence and corruption stands out. Over 50% of the people of the businesses say that this is what is my biggest concern. If we can tackle that, and this is something that has been said, we have whole heap of anecdotes about it, but the data does in fact indicate that this is the one single most important drawback to greater productivity and greater profitability and perhaps economic growth.
And that's consistent with the Global Competitiveness Report also.
Absolutely.
Which says that. So therefore, unless we address the issue of the crime, we're not going to see the 5 in 4.
Absolutely.
Or no, 5 in 3.
Absolutely.
Because it's 2020.
Major factor. I mean, I don't remember what the second point is, because everything else pales in significance to the emphasis that people place, businesses place on that one factor, crime and violence and corruption, as being a major drawback to positive development.
What other factors did they mention, though, in terms of?
Well, again, obviously, it was to do with what they see as the kind of bureaucracy and the red tape which they have to go through, which they believe is deleterious. They spend too much time really getting through these processes. And some of those that are actually mentioning factors outside of crime and violence are saying the government is really not doing enough to really ease the flow of business and help them to really do business better, So that, just picture the euphoric and the kind of almost idealistic situation where businesses have a minimum of crime and violence to deal with and fewer restrictions in terms of the way they do business. You could imagine the kinds of positives. That's what they're saying, and that is a major factor that one needs to be considered.
And if we go back to the consumer then, in terms of their spending, is there anything they are planning to spend on and anything they're specifically planning to reduce their spending on?
We look at 3 categories, and I think the more we think about it, the more we should be broadening those categories. But it's motor vehicles, and so the key indicators as to what motor vehicles, houses, and vacation plans, right? We saw in the last quarter a big boost in terms of purchase intentions. So people are saying, yeah, boy, jobs are going to come on stream. I can plan for vacation. I can plan to buy a car. I can plan to buy a house or pay down on a house and so on. First quarter of 2017, those overall plans have dipped significantly. We're talking about a 5 percentage point on a basis of 20-something percent. You're talking about 25, 26, but significant fall off. And therefore, this is all in line with what people are saying. The consumers are saying, I'm getting impatient and not seeing the kinds of benefits that I am told would accrue to me. The 1.5, yeah, it's come and go, but it hasn't really nudged me in terms of what I can do. And now I'm further and further away from touching the reality of benefits that I expect to come.
It is one of the arguments that you've heard that, okay, fine, we've gotten the additional tax break, but additional taxes have also been put on. That has been mentioned?
It has been mentioned significantly. People are saying that, so I get this break, but I have to pay more for gas, I have to pay more for a number of different things, and therefore, to what extent did I really benefit? Am I really benefiting? That's the concern that consumers are saying. And, when you think about all the various facets that have been sort of articulated, you can understand why consumers, certainly in the first quarter, are not as confident as they were before. Things are coming to a head almost from a different number of perspectives, but all coming and converging on their ability to have disposable income too.
And your survey would not have included the property tax effect.
No.
And so that came after.
Absolutely.
Which means that you're going to say even a greater issue with that now.
I mentioned in the presentation that I'm very anxious to see what the second quarter data is going to look like. We are in the field now. We're obviously picking up things that would have arisen since the budget.
And you hear about the property tax issue.
Absolutely. So we're very keen. I mean, it's almost like I wish I could advance the thing to July. To see what it looks like.
When is that going to come out?
July.
Okay.
We're past the midpoint in terms of the field work, and therefore we've accumulated most of the data already. But again, we don't process until when we have completed all 600 and all 100.
So this is highly anticipated for July then.
Anticipated for July.
You can sell it as a major show.
I believe
coming
so.
up in July.
I believe so.
Yeah, because I personally, I think that from an economic point of view, the first quarter definitely was better than the second quarter.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
What's going to happen in the second quarter?
Yeah. I don't want to say, but based on the trend, the pattern, and what we know has happened in the economy since then with the new taxes and so on.
And the flood.
And the flood,
flooding,
of course. The flood is going to be a massive factor in all of this, One would expect a fair amount of dilution of confidence in the second quarter. But I'm hoping I'm wrong. But this is certainly what we're picking up from the data that we have looked at, that there could be further challenges. So
we actually could see, in addition to a dip in consumer confidence, maybe reduce negative growth if we had flat in.
Could be.
Well, let's see how it pans out and done. Thanks a lot for joining us on Point. Really great having you here. As I said,
it's good to be here. First time on your program.
Pulse extraordinaire. Continue to do the good work.
I'll try my best.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, what do you need to know to protect your intellectual property? Welcome back. Recent high-profile cases have brought the issue of intellectual property protection to the fore. Here's more on that.
In a case that gripped headlines, Lasco Distributors Limited wanted $490 million as the full payout from Pfizer for damages incurred after the company was legally blocked from selling a drug. However, Pfizer argued against that figure, saying Lasco should only get $518,000 for the period it was not allowed to sell the drug. Lasco Distributors has claimed that it suffered damages when it was barred by a court order between 2005 to 2012 from distributing the drug Norvasc, which is used to treat high blood pressure. Lasco took the matter to court, and in 2012, the United Kingdom Privy Council upheld rulings by the local courts which favored Lasco. Lasco then took legal action to recover the money from Pfizer, which had obtained the restraining order against Lasco, barring their distribution of the drug. While that case was in the courts, the Jamaica Customs Agency and JIPO were busy trying to enforce intellectual property rules in other quarters. Some of these efforts included the removal of illegal DVDs being sold on the street to giving entrepreneurs vital information to protect their intellectual property.
Joining us now are Sophia Clark, Copyright Manager, and Mr. Marcus Goff, Deputy Director and Legal Counsel, both from the Jamaica Intellectual Property Office. Welcome to On Point.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Sophia. What is JIPO? I don't think many people out there are aware of JIPO.
JIPO is the Jamaica Intellectual Property Office, which is a government agency tasked with the administration of the intellectual property laws of Jamaica, basically to give advice on intellectual property and to register and protect the intellectual property of the copyright of the intellectual property owners.
So, Marcus, why is JIPO important? I mean, why should anybody pay any mind to
Well,
JIPO?
basically, IP is important because it is the
IP, that's intellectual property.
Yes. That is the stock in trade of most Jamaicans. Whereas many of us may not have had the chance to go, high up in school, may not have formal education, or may not be formally employed. We all have some form of IP rights, some creativity, whether you write a song, you dance, a poem, etc. It's what Jamaicans are made of.
But then, I mean, the public out there could say that we're really not doing anything to protect it, because if you go down to Half a Tree now, you see that people selling all sorts of copyright CDs and all of those things. What are we doing to deal with that sort of situation, to ensure that the intellectual property of people are protected?
Well, the owners of intellectual property need to be vigilant and to protect their work. We encourage persons to come and register, but registration is not the end of it. The way you then have to enforce those rights by, as you say, being vigilant, looking and seeing how it's being used, if it's being used, by whom and when, and taking the necessary action to make sure that any infringement is stopped and prevented.
But wouldn't one of the roles of JIPO be to actually do that policing? I mean, that service is not offered for people who, once people register, as I said, the people are out there openly selling the CDs. JIPO wouldn't play such a role?
JIPO doesn't undertake enforcement, and if you imagine, somebody said recently, asking that task of JIPO would be similar to going to the titles office and asking them to guard persons' homes and prevent them being, broken into or taken away from them. That is outside of our purview. And as I said, it's your property right, essentially. And if you own intellectual property, which, as Dr. Goff has said, most of us do, it's your right and it's up to you. You have the responsibility.
So who are the people? You're talking about authors, artists, anyone who develops something and wants to copyright it, like
anyone who creates anything,
like
business persons, because your name is a trademark, or can be a trademark, which is also intellectual property. Your brand.
So if I come and register my name, no one can call themselves Dennis again.
Well, they can't call themselves Dennis to do what you do. No.
Okay. So Marcus, what are the laws that protect intellectual property, and then how would we enforce them? If JIPO is not the arm who enforced it, how would these laws be enforced?
Okay, so IP rights are broad. It starts from copyright, which covers music, poetry, dance, film, etc. Back to inventions. People who deal with scientific inventions are covered by patents. We have designers, for fashion and other types of products. They have design rights. And we also have trademarks, as Ms. Clark mentioned, which governs a wide range of business endeavors. And we also have geographical indications, which is more to do with protecting particular products which have some authentic reputation or characteristic.
Like Jamaican Jer.
Right, right. So these are different rights for different types of creative outputs. In terms of enforcement is really done primarily through the courts. A person may sue, get an injunction or compensation for infringement.
But then we know how the courts work in Jamaica. I mean, your grandchildren might end up dealing with the case.
It takes time. It does take time.
Yeah.
I mean, we are hoping to.
But isn't that a part of the problem then? Because it makes no sense to have an intellectual property framework in place, but then when people want to protect that, it's going to take them years and years to deal with that situation.
Well, I think the issue is really to do with justice on a whole, you know, because all rights that we have are going to be vindicated through the courts. So we need to have rights. We can't say because it takes time to enforce them that the rights are futile, you know. What we need to do is to sharpen our enforcement. So I think that on that scale, that's more to do with a national agenda through the Ministry of Justice to really have justice be speedy. But there's also, of course, criminal enforcement for IP rights as well. So if you find someone who's out there using your trademark or using your copyright work, you can take a complaint to the police and they will have the power to arrest and prosecute.
But I would think, Sophia, that a part of setting up bodies like JIPO is to ensure that it's easier for people to enforce their rights. And that, I think, is one of the biggest issues we face. So what is JIPO doing from an advocacy point of view to ensure that, you know, people can enforce their rights much easier?
I think the main thing that we engage in is public education, because most people are not aware, and in view of the difficulties with the court system, it's important that persons are aware and are active. And I always advise people that when there is an issue or a perceived issue with regards to infringement of their rights, that they seek to engage with persons one-to-one initially to try and resolve the issue before it escalates and has to go to court. So I think that it's important that we raise awareness about intellectual property, and that's one of the driving forces behind JIPO is to, I mean, we hold seminars, we go into schools and various types of organizations to engage with persons to bring a better understanding of intellectual property rights and how to enforce them.
But then JIPO also must also help with enforcement for people who deliberately infringe, eh? I mean, that's the stage we need to get to also. Eh?
I mean, we assist in the sense that we arm those who come and register with the necessary evidence that they need if they need to go and prosecute. And also we engage with various departments of the police who come to us for information often about where infringement is taking place and how, etc.
And has there ever been any arrests and, you know, people being carried to court for this who have been successful?
Absolutely. During IP Week, just a few weeks ago, one of the activities for the week was what we refer to as Destruction Day. And this is where we organize the destruction of property which has been seized, infringing goods which has been seized, and there's persons have gone to court and there's been sentenced, etc. Yeah, and now the goods, as a consequence of that, the goods are being.
And we need to publicize those cases, eh?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so we need to have some public education.
You heard about the Clark Shoes raid?
Yes, I heard about that one.
That was quite high profile too. So that's the kind of work that we do with the police.
Okay. So tell me, Marcus, how do people register a trademark or a patent? I know there's a thing called, you can register through JIPO, but there's also a thing I've heard about a poor man's copyright, where you mail something to yourself or something like that.
Right. So for most of our registration processes, you simply fill out a form at JIPO. The form is online on our website, and you know, it's going to ask you basic information about who you are and what you want to protect, and you pay the fee, and it's as simple as that. We have a recent system for copyright registration, which has moved beyond the poor man's copyright. So we now have a system where you can also file with us your songs, your poetry, your films, and have those also registered as proof of your ownership of copyright.
Okay, and Sophia, how do you enforce against people overseas who is taking advantage of local persons? Like you have the Bob Marley brand, the Usain Bolt, and so the Jerk.
Right.
You know, how do we enforce to ensure that that brand is protected?
You would need to engage attorneys in those jurisdictions where
Okay.
your
So
infringement is taking place.
you have no jurisdiction over that.
No, in every case when it comes to intellectual property, the rights granted to you are within the jurisdiction. So if something is happening overseas, those persons would have had to have registered overseas to protect themselves in that jurisdiction. And in order to enforce those rights, they would then have to engage legal assistance in that area.
Okay, and the case, Marcus, of Lasco and Pfizer, that is an instance of copy, that doesn't have to do with
No, that
copyright.
was to do with patents pertaining to pharmaceutical drugs.
Right. So in that case, it is that they were stopped from selling and they lost some money because of that.
Right.
Right? So have you ever had cases of people coming and filing complaints that turned out that it is not enforceable?
Yes, I mean, when you go to court, you may win or you may lose depending on the strength of your case. And very often times you may think you have a strong case, but then you may not know what the other person has to also show, because in Jamaica, even though you don't have to register, you get certain benefits from registering, but if you don't register, you still have certain rights.
Right.
And so you may have certain rights based on a long period of usage, which may even be able to, supersede if you were taken to court.
And if someone can prove that someone has been exploiting their brand,
Yes.
they can actually get compensated from the profits that person has gotten.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, plus an injunction from the court to have them to stop producing and selling. And also the court can order the destruction of the goods, which is what Ms. Clark mentioned,
Yeah.
that we do each April for
Yeah, because I know sometimes we've had cases of counterfeit things coming from China and that sort of thing, eh?
Yes.
And you get involved in that process.
Right, so we work with customs as well, who are also a major player on the IP enforcement front. So they also are charged to, of course, search and seize infringing goods coming through the borders where they find them. And for that, we also help to prove who is the rightful owner of the IP rights.
So, Sophia, what do you have to say to the people out there now? I mean, I still get back to the whole thing about the blatant act of the selling of the CDs, or obviously copyrighted, and people even create some nice labels, and put on them, What is your message to those people out there?
I think that, as Marcus has said earlier, all of us have some value with regards to intellectual property rights. We're very creative people, and it is indeed, I think, our strength. It's how we've impacted the world, and I think that is part of the message that we bring when we're teaching, is for each of us to value our own intellectual property, and that will help us to appreciate that of others. Persons need to enforce their rights, but I think there has to be like a cultural change, an acceptance, a recognition of the power that we have, and the damage that we're doing to other people when we simply take and steal from them, that it is their wealth, it's their own, that they have generated from within themselves. And when we begin to look at it like that, I think it will help to change that type of behavior. But ultimately, it is in the hands of the owner of the right to take action and to enforce that right.
Have we done any assessment of the financial value lost because people have infringed on other people's IP? Because I keep going back to the thing of the use of the Jamaican brand. What is the value that we have lost as a country? Has anything like that been done? Because I'm sure it's significant, eh?
That's where we need people like yourself now, Mr. Chong, economists. Yes, we need persons to be able to assist, to really pay focused attention on these issues, to help us to make the case that we need to really see IP not as just a hobby, those who dance and sing for JCDC or for All Together Sing, but really as a means to a livelihood and for nation building. And to do that, we need to actually get the data to show how much we are losing, how much we can earn, not only in Jamaica, but globally from Brand Jamaica and from our own personal creativity. And that's where I think we also are lacking.
But I would think that this is something, because I see where there's a lot of value that you can gain from it. But I would think that this is something where the government, from a policy point of view, would want to push.
Yes.
But again, you don't hear a lot about JIPO. You don't hear enough being said about intellectual property. So what's happening? Our government's not performing as they should?
I think, as Ms. Clark has said, it's a cultural change. It's a national change that we are working to envelop here, because, of course, historically, Jamaica has relied upon agriculture, we've relied upon tourism, and more recently remittances. But the cultural and creative industries is where the future, certainly from a type of perspective, lies, and that's what we're aiming to build an appreciation of nationally.
Okay, all right. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. We've certainly learned a lot. I'm sure the public has learned a lot too. So thank you for coming on to On Point. And when we come back, we'll have the numbers and the word on the street. Welcome back to On Point. Here are the numbers behind the findings of the latest Business and Consumer Indices survey.
Business confidence fell to a reading of 139.3, down from 142 in the December 2016 quarter. According to the survey, when asked whether they expected an increase or decrease in business taxes for the next fiscal year, 60% of all firms expected a tax increase, compared with just 8% that anticipated a decline. Regarding the prospects for the economy, current returns on investments improved to a reading of 103 from 101.2. Investment or expansion climate decreased to a reading of 129 from 141. Expected change in the economy increased to 141, coming from 130.3. While expected change in profitability fell to a reading of 160 from 165.4. Current job prospects rose to a reading of 23 from 20.3. Meanwhile, for the March quarter of 2017, the Conference Board's Index of Consumer Confidence fell to a reading of 138.7 relative to 151.6 in the December quarter.
And our On Point team hit the streets and asked Jamaicans, have your finances improved in the past year?
The economy now, but the liquor where you get, it still can't help, but you have to just make two ends meet. You see me? So I just work with the flow.
Now earn more business kind of slow.
Well, it's not much of a hopes I see happening at the point in time right now, because the promises we have gotten, we do know things do take time, but again, on the other hand, it's not, to me in my sight, that boy looks up as what we had wished for.
Yeah, well, the year just starts still, but I see more progression, more better than last year coming up.
Well, we've had a pretty interesting show today. I was here solo without Kalila. She'll be back next week. But we discussed some very interesting points. First one, Jamaica Intellectual Property Office and intellectual property is something that we have not taken enough stock of in Jamaica and determine the value, really utilize the value that we can gain from it. And we had some very interesting discussion. What is obvious to me is that although we have the office there's not enough being said about it, not enough education about it. And maybe that's one of the areas that we need to look at in terms of improving the value of the Jamaican brand and the earnings from it. And then we had a very interesting discussion with Mr. Don Anderson from Market Research Services Limited, who is the person who always does the work for the Business and Consumer Indices survey and presents it. And, we're seeing some worrying trends develop. Hopefully we'll have him back in July when he assesses the second quarter, because it doesn't seem as if things are going to be too rosy going into the second quarter. And the question we have is, what is going to happen to the 5 in 3? because we had projected 3% growth for the calendar year, and it seems as if we're going to come in at just about 1 to 1.5%. Well, that's our show for today. Thanks to our very hard-working production team and, of course, our sponsors, and also you for joining us on this episode of On Point. I'll see you again next week. I'm Dennis Chung.
On Point was brought to you by National Baking Company.